Hello, everyone. Welcome to our the recording of our facilitation training. Thank you all for taking the time to watch this training. I just wanted to start off with a very nice quote. Training is the most undervalued and yet most effective way to become better activists. So thank you for taking the time to do this training and to learn some facilitation skills. And we will get started right away. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is basics of a good meeting. So as a facilitator, you often need to think about what sort of environment can help create the space for a good and productive meeting, and then make sure that those things are in place. So some examples are making sure that the meeting always starts on time. Usually like you can give like 1 to 2 minutes for people to kind of come in. You don't want to start more than 5 minutes afterwards because, as we know, everyone's time is valuable. So we encourage everyone to arrive on time so that meetings can start right away. Make sure to state the start time and the end time so that people know how long a meeting is expected to take. Make sure that there's a quiet space. If you're doing a meeting in person or a training or whatever it is, make sure that there's like no doors kind of opening or shutting. If it's online, make sure that everyone is muted as unless they're speaking. Um, Always ensuring that you have a facilitator, or if there's large groups, co-facilitators are always good so that you can split up tasks. Making sure that there's a minute taker, welcoming everyone, stating the purpose of meetings, making sure that there's an agenda, and inviting everyone to add to the agenda. Sometimes it's good to allocate time for different agenda points so that there's kind of a general overview of how many agenda points you might be able to get through in a meeting. Make sure that everyone knows any group agreements or community participation guidelines so that people know what to expect in the space. If there are new individuals who might be joining for the first time, kind of going over those group agreements and inviting anyone to add to them is always an option so that people know what to expect and feel included in those decisions. Making sure that when people are speaking, everyone is speaking clearly and slowly so that people can understand, especially those who maybe might not have English as a first language. Using hand signals, and don't be afraid to be human. People can say, like, it's no problem saying that it's your first time facilitating, you haven't done much facilitation before. So kind of just, yeah, bear with you as you go. So we're going to go over some hand signals. I'm just going to stop the sharing for a moment. So for hand signals, we have a point. So if someone has a point that they want to make, they can hold up one finger like this, and that person will go ahead in the queue. If someone has a direct point to make, which is something factual to add, usually like one sentence, like 10, no more than kind of like 10 words, you can hold up a direct point like this. So this would go ahead of anyone who just has a point that they would like to make. A direct point, it can't be used to like jump ahead and say your point first in front of someone who has a point. It has to be something that's factual that adds to what someone is currently saying. For example, you're discussing an action and someone has made a point about the action, they're talking about it, someone has a direct fact to add, they hold up a direct point. Maybe their direct point is those materials that we need, the shop closes in 30 minutes, so if we want to get them, we're going to have to leave soon. So that's a direct point. It directly adds something to what someone is saying. Another thing is agreement. So if someone is saying something, rather than like repeating points or multiple people saying the same points, holding up their hand saying, yes, I agree, we just use jazz hands. We also use technical points. So a technical point is a T. So that's something that directly affects the meeting from going ahead. So say like there's 5 minutes left. Someone could hold up a technical point saying that there's 5 minutes remaining. If like there's a fire in someone's house or in the building where you're having a meeting, or something that's directly going to affect the meeting from going ahead, that's a technical point. If you're on Zoom and someone's sound isn't working or they're frozen, that's a technical point. It's impacting the meeting from going ahead, all of those things. And then we have a clarification, which is a C. So if someone is speaking, you're not quite understanding what they're saying, you can hold up a clarification, asking them to reword it, or say someone's using like jargon and you're not quite sure what a word means, you can ask for clarification or for them to use, yeah, a different word. What else do we have? We also have blocks, which is an X. So if someone is saying something and you feel that what they're saying is directly harmful either to individuals or to the movement, you can hold up a block so that your concerns are addressed and maybe alternatives are used. So those are our hand signals. So we're going to go ahead now and move on to decision making. So in decision making, we use, so the first one we're going to talk about is consensus decision making. So consensus decision making is decisions that are made by a group where everyone has an equal voice, everyone is contributing to the decision. And in the end, all parties are agreeing on the same decision. And throughout that process, everyone who is in the group is discussing like the pros and cons, any concerns, to make sure that the entire group is coming to a informed decision that that everyone is happy with and agrees that it can move forward. So consensus decision making is a process in which groups come to an agreement without voting, and it has been a central feature of direct action movements for nearly 40 years, from the anti-nuclear movement in the 1970s to the turn of the millennium global justice movement in 2011's Occupy Wall Street. Instead of voting a controversial plan up or down, groups that make decisions by consensus work to refine the plan until everyone finds it acceptable. And in the description, we'll put a link to more information on consensus decision making if anyone would want to take a look. So next thing we're going to talk about is consensus versus consent in decision making. So sometimes it can be hard to come to a consensus and have everyone in a group agree on the same thing. So when you look at this diagram, kind of on the inside, you have consensus decision making. So that's, like I mentioned, when everyone is involved in discussing and forming a decision, and in the end, everyone agrees with it to move forward. So in consensus decision making, it's all about individuals' personal preferences. So everyone agrees that this decision is something that they are personally okay with it moving forward. And this often works maybe in smaller teams, in teams where kind of everyone has maybe the same background, same like vision for their teams. But when we get into people who maybe have some different views, come from different backgrounds, or maybe just in those same groups that can usually get a consensus. Sometimes people might not always agree. It's not essential that everyone agrees on something. That's when we have lots of discussions, which are always good. And so sometimes when we can't come to a consent, so not everyone approves of something moving forward, we can look at, does anyone object? So when we're looking at consent-based decision making, we're looking at our range of tolerance rather than our personal preferences. So you may have the majority of people who are agreeing with a decision, maybe some who aren't quite on board. And so you can ask for kind of people's range of tolerance. So say you're trying to choose a location for a training to happen. Some people chose location A, some people chose location B. Maybe there's more people who chose location B, so you can ask people, does anyone object with it being done here? And if no one objects, then cool, you have a decision and your group can move forward. So those people who maybe chose the other option, it's not their personal preference that it happens there, but they'll tolerate it. They're fine with it in the end. So the important thing here is that there are no objections. So if someone does object to a decision, then that person must be given the opportunity to maybe clarify anything, ask for any modifications, or in some cases, they might just not agree with the decision. They might think that it could be harmful in whatever way. And in that case, kind of the process would start over again with ideas being discussed, seeing if a different option, if the group can either come to a consensus or consent, and kind of go through that process again. So we're gonna, sorry, just pass that. So getting consensus, we're gonna talk about getting consensus and moving on. So while you're kind of discussing these different ideas, the facilitator, as you're going along, you always want to kind of be summarizing what is happening within the discussion to make sure that everyone is able to follow the discussion. So if any decisions have already been made, you can remind people, we've decided on A, B, and C. We're now trying to decide on X, Y, Z. And as you're going through and kind of making these decisions and moving on to other things to talk about, you always want to be checking for consensus or checking for consent. So we do that often using temperature checks. So it can be like yes or no. So say you're trying to decide again on like a location for a training. You can say like, okay, we're going to do a temperature check. Hands up here if you agree that this location is acceptable, down here if you're not agreeing, kind of in the middle if you still have some concerns or any questions that you want to ask or clarifying, so you can kind of get a sense of where people are at. If everyone has their hands up here, you get your consensus, cool, you can move on to the next decision. Another thing that you can use, so rather than just having those three options, you can like gauge things with like say 10 up top, 0 down below, and do kind of like a range to see where people are at on a scale of 1 to 10. That obviously doesn't really work in person, but it can work for online meetings. And if you're going through, you're doing these temperature checks, and you haven't yet reached consensus, or you haven't reached consent, you can then again summarize what's being discussed, what has been the ideas that have been discussed so far, and then kind of put it back to the group to have another discussion about it. And then after everyone has had a chance to like ask more questions, discuss it a little bit farther, you can then check for consensus again, check for consent if there's no objections. And then if you get a decision, great. If you still have no decision, then you can ask if people are okay with moving the decision to a following meeting. So sometimes maybe just having like the constraint of a meeting time, it might make it more difficult to make decisions. So if it's carried over to a next meeting, then people have like a week or however long to kind of think about it, maybe think about alternatives, different things to kind of bring back to a following week to then discuss it further. So that's always something good to do if you're kind of spending a lot of time on one decision, and maybe there's other things that you can use that meeting time for and give people kind of the space to maybe cool off and just think about it, and then come back to it at another week. Another thing that you can do is kind of delegate decisions, or delegate maybe different like projects to kind of a subgroup of people. So sometimes when you're talking about something, say we take the training example again. So if you're trying to talk about like the date, the time, the location, all of that stuff around a training, in the end, you have the group who has decided like, yes, we want this training to go ahead, but you're using that meeting time to kind of discuss all of the details. It's good to sometimes just maybe ask if there's a couple people who want to kind of work out all of those details. They can do it on their own time, kind of outside of the regular meeting space, to kind of save time from the rest of the group, and then maybe just bring back those decisions to the group at a later date. So yeah, those are a couple of things that you can do. So next thing that we're going to talk about is facilitation. So what is facilitation? So first thing to start off, facilitation, being a facilitator, it's not about telling people what to do. It's about helping to provide a space for discussion and enabling the group to come to creative, collective solutions to issues that everyone wants to participate in deliberating upon. So this also helps, having a facilitator also helps to come to decisions in a timely manner without spending lots of time kind of going round and round in circles before coming to a decision. So in every group, there should be a facilitator. If there's a large group or a long meeting, sometimes it's good to have co-facilitators who either say one is going through like the content, one is checking the chat, like chat on Zoom, or checking hand signals, all of that stuff, maybe keeping track of time, or even having co-facilitators to kind of break up the material. So maybe one facilitates for the first hour, someone else facilitates for the second hour, where you kind of break it up so that it's not just one person talking for the whole time. So that facilitator is responsible for ensuring that the basics of a good meeting are followed, like ensuring the meeting runs to time, hand signals are being used both appropriately and effectively, and that those who are present are able to discuss topics and come to decisions as a group. One thing that's very important is that the facilitator does not need to remain the same across consecutive meetings. So in fact, it's more effective if this responsibility is shared out and people take turns acting in this role in different meetings. That just kind of helps break down any sort of maybe power dynamics within a group and allows everyone to, get that chance to be a facilitator and to practice facilitating and knowing what everyone's thoughts in the group are. And so to ensure that everyone has a chance to facilitate, a suggestion can be to create a rota. And at the end of each meeting, you state who is going to be the facilitator for the next meeting. You can also do that with minute taking. So every week you switch up who is the facilitator, who is the minute taker, so that that responsibility is shared out between everyone in the group. So why do we need facilitation and why do we use consensus and consent-based decision making? So in every group, there is some sort of power dynamics, just as there is in any human interaction. So if we don't consciously structure a group for participation, the group won't necessarily be structureless, but it will fall back on default structures and power relationships of the society that we live in. For example, women speaking less than men. So the aim of these different decision making and facilitation is to structure those relationships to approximate values of equality and respect through the engagement of participation. And as an added bonus, well-facilitated groups come up with the best creative solutions, which is called what we call the collective intelligence of the group. So just to kind of sum it up, in any meeting, we have decisions that need to be made, different views on what the best decision might be, and a limited time to make them. So your aim as a facilitator is to get to what the group thinks, not just you. So what the group thinks is the best or most creative decision that does not have any objections by any group members. As a facilitator, we always need to be mindful of keeping separate what we think is best and what the group thinks is best. So not that saying that as a facilitator, you don't have an opinion as well. You just need to make sure that you're sharing your opinion and also hearing everyone else's thoughts to make sure that you're incorporating everyone's thoughts and ideas and coming up with the best decision that the group has all agreed on. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is main things to keep in mind as a facilitator. So there's lots of things that we need to keep in mind as facilitators, but some kind of just general things that are always good for a facilitator is to know how to encourage participation, how to deal with difficult people, and how to get consensus and move on. So we've also already talked about the third one. So we're going to go over the first two. So how can we as a facilitator encourage participation and how can we deal with difficult people in meeting spaces? So there are multiple ways in which we can encourage participation. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's lots more things that you can come up with. But just a few things, making sure to always ask people if they have questions. Do go-arounds where everyone can speak. So if you're having setting forward a proposal, you can give everyone kind of like 1 to 2 minutes to maybe brainstorm their own thoughts before kind of bringing them out to the group, and then ask for everyone to in turn say what they think so that everyone has a chance to share their ideas. Introductions at the start of meetings, introductions, check-ins, all of that stuff helps to encourage participation, because often when someone speaks for a first time in a meeting, say in a check-in, they might feel more comfortable in the space and be more likely to share again in the future. Acknowledging everyone's contributions, calling people by name rather than saying, has anyone not spoken yet? So if you notice that someone hasn't spoken yet, rather than just saying, anyone who's not spoken, would you like to add anything? You can call people by name and ask if they want to share anything. Asking Yes, sometimes splitting up rooms or having breakout rooms and workshops helps to encourage participation. Maybe there's some people who aren't comfortable sharing their thoughts in front of a large group, but are more comfortable talking in breakout rooms. That's always a good option to give people, especially when you're trying to do, like, say, brainstorming or talking about different proposals, different things like that. And brainstorming is always a good thing to encourage participation. And when you're offering up brainstorming, a good thing to do is to always allow people a few minutes to brainstorm on their own before brainstorming as a group. If you just start brainstorming as a group, often people might get stuck on what other people are saying and not be able to kind of get to their own thoughts. But if you give them time ahead to think about what they want to share, then it gives them the chance to gather their ideas and not be influenced or overwhelmed by what others are saying. So you get ideas that are truly their own and not influenced by others in the group. A couple more things to keep in mind are inclusion. So facilitators are responsible for creating inclusive spaces. So the facilitator should moderate participation to ensure that everyone is able to speak should they want to. The facilitator can engage participants by inviting people to speak and by conversely asking people not to speak. If you notice that someone is speaking a lot or has already spoken, you can ask if anyone else wants to speak and ask them to maybe take a step back for a certain question, or saying something like, we've heard a couple of ideas from you. Is there anyone else who would like to add anything? And if not, then we're going to move on to the next topic. Maybe mentioning something about time. If someone is speaking a lot, you can ask them to kind of round up their thoughts. A hand signal that we use kind of for roundups is this one here. So if someone is talking a lot and occupying a lot of airtime, you can ask them to round up their thoughts so that we can move on or ask other people to share. Another thing the facilitator should be keeping in mind is making sure that people's needs are met. So giving people the opportunity to either share with the facilitator if it's in person, or share maybe directly to the facilitator in a Zoom chat if they have any specific disabilities or needs that the facilitator should be aware of, to try to do whatever they can to meet that individual's needs and make sure that they're comfortable and are able to participate, whether that's just participating in the chat or maybe participating in breakout rooms, different things like that. Another thing that we need to keep in mind as a facilitator is ensuring that the pace isn't too quick. So if, say, there's like people have a hard time paying attention over Zoom, or people might not speak English as their first language, we need to be aware of that and ask people to make sure, if they're speaking too quickly, to slow down. Maybe build in a minute for kind of quiet reflection after each decision is made before you move on. So if anyone does have anything additional they want to add, they're given the space to kind of think about it, process it, and then see if they have anything else they want to add. Maybe having like 10-20-second pauses after each speaker is also good to kind of let the information sink in. Another thing with pace is ensuring you're keeping track of the time and the pace of the meeting to make sure that everything that needs to be discussed is discussed. And then a last thing is building trust. So as a facilitator, you can build trust into your meetings by giving people space to check in and check out. which are great ways of both opening and closing the space, that include everyone and give people kind of the chance to learn more about each other. Usually when people feel comfortable around the group, they're more likely to participate and share their ideas. And yeah, so there's a couple of, I'm sure you can Google questions or come up with your own questions. Some other things that are good are like throughout the meetings, if you notice that kind of energy is dropping, you can add in like a quick little energizer activity or a quick little get to know you activity to kind of take people's minds off of what's being currently discussed, focus on building like the group, building your connections with all of those in the group, asking some kind of get to know you questions, and then kind of moving back to the meeting. But it's good to get to know everyone who you're sharing the space with. So the next thing we're going to talk about is difficult people. So in many meetings situations, it's likely that at some point you will come across people within a meeting space or a training space who may be difficult in different ways. So some ways could be that people aren't following the expected behaviors or who are showing disrespect. People who are argumentative, negative, who can't kind of agree to disagree and just want to keep debating topics. Maybe people who are making inappropriate comments, who are being aggressive, people who may be intoxicated during meetings, who maybe aren't interested in learning or don't have a lack of cultural awareness, people who abuse privilege, or people who are manipulative. Those again are just a couple of examples. There's lots of different people that we might come across. One suggestion that I can give you in all of these situations when we do have to address these sorts of people as a facilitator to ensure that our meeting spaces are safe for everyone. There is no right or wrong answer in these situations. One suggestion that I can give you is that it can be helpful for many of these different examples that are mentioned. Something that's helpful is to call people in and have like a one-on-one chat with them. So rather than maybe in the space specifically calling people out, addressing those behaviors in the big group, you can kind of call people in, maybe say that we're going to have like a 5-minute break, and you can pull that person aside to kind of maybe remind them of any group agreements that they might be breaking. Maybe they're not abiding by the principles and values of the organization, just as like a couple of examples. And you can mention that some of those behaviors aren't following what we have agreed. And if they continue to do so within that space for the safety and the well-being of the rest of the group, they may be asked to leave. As a facilitator, it is kind of one of your responsibilities to ensure that everyone is comfortable and safe within our spaces. And you never want to let one person who is being disruptive kind of take down the group that would maybe otherwise be running smoothly. So these types of situations may not arise too often, but we do need to be aware that they could happen, and that when they do, we need to talk with these people, call them in, and yeah, just try to get at maybe why they're feeling a certain way, and maybe how we can help them contribute to the space, or maybe asking them to take a step back. Some other examples, so those situations you might not come into contact too much. Some that you might experience more often are people who are talking too much, or people who are going off point or repeating themselves. So when people are talking too much, you can do things like gently interrupting them, using their name, value their contribution, maybe summarize what they're saying, and just kind of remind them of the values of the group, that we want to encourage participation. So we're going to ask if others would like to either respond to the point or add something. So for example, if you have someone whose name is Jack, say you're talking about a university talk, You're talking about the date and the time, kind of all of the information about a talk that you want to have at a university. And you have Jack, who is like talking too much. You can say something like, Jack, thank you for the points that you've raised. They sound very interesting, very important. What you seem to be saying is that it's very important for this talk to go ahead. We have minuted that we want it to go ahead, and we're talking about the date and time. I hear that you have some ideas and we have heard them, and I'm sure that other people also have some views on this subject. So I would like to ask if anyone else has any ideas on the points that Jack has raised. And similarly, you can use kind of the same structure for other like tricky interventions, like for when people are going off point or repeating ideas. So say you have Maria who's repeating the same ideas, maybe kind of going round and round in circles. You can, again, gently interrupt them, thank them for their contributions, and then say something like, so Maria, what you're saying sounds really good, that we definitely need to have this talk. My understanding is that we have agreed that the talk is going ahead and it's been minuted. And for that purpose, we're no longer talking about whether it's going to go ahead or not. What we're focusing on now is the date and the time. So you're acknowledging that what they're talking about has been agreed upon already, and sharing what has yet to be discussed and what you still need to decide on. So just this is kind of coming to the end of this talk. So as we have discussed a lot about kind of facilitation and what it means to be a good facilitator, what it means to make decisions as a group. And I'm sure that everyone is excited now to practice their facilitation skills. But what we also need to take into account is what it means to be a good participant. So we are not only responsible for taking on the role of the facilitator in some cases. In a lot of meetings, we are also participants. So we are responsible for creating a considerate space in which everyone is able to participate. So therefore, we always need to be reflecting on our own involvement in the meeting as a participant, not just as a facilitator. So what does it mean to be a good participant, and kind of ease the role of the facilitator? So in being a good participant, we are abiding by the hand signals, muting ourselves when we're not speaking, respecting the rules of any meetings or any community participation guidelines or group agreements, respecting the role of the facilitator. So there may not always be time for everyone to say what they wanted. And what's important is that we acknowledge that the facilitator is always being mindful of the time and trying to allow everyone to speak, so that so it's important that we respect the role of the facilitator and acknowledge that they are doing their best to make sure that everyone is heard, including us. So we might not always get the chance to say what we want to, but that's okay. We want to always practice active listening. So not just listening to respond, but listening to understand what everyone is saying. We always need to mind the time when we're speaking and think before you speak. So consider if what you want to say is vital to the conversation or is necessary. Sometimes maybe we just want to speak for the sake of speaking. I know that that's something that I'm guilty of sometimes, and I'm sure many people also do that. It's not always necessary for us to add something to the meeting. Sometimes it's good just to add a jazz hands when someone is speaking, rather than putting up a hand to kind of say what's already been said. So that goes on to not repeating points. So if someone has already said your point, you've had your finger up, you're in the queue, someone has said your point, you can put down your hand, saying that you no longer want to speak. Or if someone comes to you, then in the queue, you can mention someone has already said the idea, you can move on to the next person. And then the last thing is you can offer up your spot to the queue to maybe someone who hasn't spoken yet. So if you notice that there's someone in the queue who hasn't said anything yet and you're ahead of them, you can mention something like, I've noticed that that Sophie has her hand up and she hasn't spoken yet, so you can go to her before coming to me. So that's something that's always nice to do as a participant. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, so I'm sure there's many more things that you can think of for ways in which we can be good participants. We just always need to make sure that we're reflecting on our own behavior in the meeting and how we can help facilitators. So then a last reminder, there's only so much kind of technical stuff that can be taught around facilitation. The best way to learn how to be an effective facilitator is to practice. So I hope that everyone goes back to their meetings or to their training spaces and practices being a facilitator. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, I will post an email in the description and also a feedback form if there's anything that you felt was maybe missing from this training that you would like to see in the future or have resources on that could be provided to you. Thank you.